In 2020, Democrats took full control of Washington.
And it will give Democrats control of the Senate.
Joe Biden has been elected.
But Republicans stood up in the states.
There was no blue wave. Democratic down-ballot disasters carried all the way to the state legislatures.
Now, we're the last line of defense against the Democrats' socialist agenda. The ways we're fighting back are bigger than you think.
Hey, thank you, and welcome back to episode 5 of It's Bigger Than You Think, a conversation about the politics that most impact our everyday lives. My name is Annie Moore. I'm your host, and joining me today is Robert Blizzard. He's with Public Opinion Strategies, and they partnered with Into America to do some qualitative research on suburban voters and what they think of the first 100 days of Joe Biden's presidency. So let's just go ahead and kick it off. Thank you, Robert, so much for joining us today and taking the time. Why did you choose to focus your research on the suburbs?
Well, I think it's important to note suburban voters, specifically in the research that we've done this research really with suburban voters nationally. So we're looking at suburban voters from across the country, from Southeast PA to Maricopa County to Oakland and Macomb counties in Michigan, Florida, Atlanta suburbs, just suburban voters across the country. So I think that's always important to remember, that this is like a national look at suburban voters. And that's important because suburban voters have been really the quintessential swing audience in almost every election. The path to the White House goes through the suburbs. The paths to the majorities of Congress and state houses across the country go through the suburbs. And Biden narrowly won the suburbs in 2020, and he won the presidency. Trump won the suburbs in 2016, and he won the presidency. So, I mean, there's definitely some evidence to the fact that you can't really win the White House or these key races without, winning the suburbs. These suburban voters, they are sophisticated voters. They are common sense voters. They are more likely to split their tickets than partisans, in urban or rural areas. And they are typically, political calculations are, I think, losing out on some of that emotional intelligence that's out there, and understanding that why behind voters' opinions, the why behind their choices. It helps provide a little more direction and nuance beyond, just how folks are feeling.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Overall, how do you think these voters are thinking about their decision to vote for Biden after his first 100 days?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for most, I would say, I think the honeymoon is over, with Biden, but I don't think the folks are filing for divorce yet. In the run up to 2020, again, suburban voters generally were in agreement with Republicans, specifically Trump's policies, but they really couldn't get past some of the rhetoric or some of the character issues. And so when Biden came into office, suburban voters were looking for more of a boring, vanilla, presidency, especially after a very chaotic 2020. Voters were exhausted. Suburban voters were exhausted. You and I were probably both exhausted. But now that we're moving past the pandemic, voters nationally, they generally believe that the worst of COVID-19 is behind us. And so what's happening is other issues are rising to the forefront. So you're seeing immigration, what's going on at the border, in a lot of more suburban areas that are closer to major metro areas across the country. You're seeing more concerns over crime. And now we're moving past, the executive order phase of the presidency. And I don't think voters are really, I don't think they're really loving what they're seeing so far now that we're getting past kind of the post-pandemic, agenda.
What would you say is their number one issue that they're the most worried about then?
I'd probably characterize it more as suburban voters are wondering what life is going to look like post-COVID. So what we're seeing right now is a tipping point on a lot of issues. The economy, what's it going to look like now? We're coming out of this pandemic. You still got unemployment rates high. You still got folks that are having trouble hiring people, especially small businesses, because of unemployment checks. You got a lot of suburban folks who are concerned about taxes and spending. What kind of country are we going to be when it comes to the immigration policy? Because we went from kind of one, radical extreme in Trump to now a radical extreme in Biden. Like we want to shut things down, law and order, which a lot of suburban voters actually kind of lean into a little bit, versus then, Biden's policies that folks think are kind of opening the border. And I think what it's interesting is how these suburban voters are looking through everything differently. They're looking through things, I would say, through a post-COVID lens. Issues with school openings, I think, is a good example. When we first started this research last year, suburban voters didn't really know much about their school districts other than, their teachers or, where their kids were going to school. They didn't know a lot about the teachers unions. They didn't know a lot about school boards or administrators. And now they're looking closer into that. But I think to the again, long-winded answer here, but I think that the number one thing that comes up over and over and over again among suburban voters is the concern over higher taxes and spending. And these are, suburban voters are center-right voters ideologically. And I think they're especially concerned about the economy and fiscal issues like taxes.
Yeah, I have a quote here from one of your people. She's a North Carolina female voter, and she shares, "Repealing the tax cuts on individuals and corporations is going to be bad on everyone. Corporations will leave the country or increase prices, and individuals who think their taxes will not increase are fooling themselves unless they are already not paying tax. It has already started. Originally, they said no tax increases for families under 400K. Now they are saying 200K. They need to raise big money, and they need for many people to be paying more, not just the relatively few wealthy." Can you kind of expand on what some of these other people are saying about Biden's tax, or like plan to raise taxes?
Yeah, I think over and over again, when they brought this issue up organically, and then when we kind of asked them more specifically, more pointed questions about taxes and a potential increase, the large wholesale look at this is that a tax increase is going to hurt the economy. And now is not the time to raise taxes since we're just coming out of the pandemic. What's interesting about suburban voters in particular is they look at issues, not just necessarily how they affect themselves personally, but how they affect kind of everything in their ecosystem. Right. What it's going to cost to drive their car, what it's going to cost to go buy groceries, what it's going to cost to purchase products and goods and other services. And their worry is that businesses and how businesses will react to tax increases are going to be laying off more workers. It's going to cause prices to increase for products and services. And they just don't think it's a good time to raise taxes at all. Because it could slow down the recovery of the economy as the country comes out of it. And, more specifically, they're very concerned about tax increases personally. Even when we asked them and gave them kind of just from whatever, news article we could find, just explaining what the tax increases would be, they're not concerned about necessarily the $400,000, income issue, because most people on our panel aren't making $400,000 a year, but they're worried about the trickle down. They worry about the effect on small businesses. They worry about the long-term effects on the economy. And they get the joke, if you will. They know that they're going to end up having to pay more, and they assume any tax increase, no matter on whose it's for or where it's going to, is going to affect them. And also, I think part of the Republican argument has to be like, showcase some of the blame here. Why are these costs going up? Why are these taxes rising? It's the Democrats' fault. It's Joe Biden's fault. And I don't think we're necessarily doing a whole lot of that right now. Another concern that came up during the discussion of this was also the repeal of the middle class, the Trump tax cuts from 2017, 2018, because many Americans paid less in taxes then. And a lot of suburban voters are even telling us now, that was among the first times they actually got refunds, and they had more money in their pocket to go and spend in the economy. So I think also a lot of this is also just, reminding voters of how strong the economy was, before COVID hit, where tax levels were now, and then how are we going to get out of this, the economic mess of the pandemic, if we're putting more of a burden on, taxpayers across the board, again, from low income, middle income to higher income, and even corporate and businesses.
So obviously, Biden's going to have to raise taxes to be able to spend on all of these massive spending bills that are going through Congress right now and that are being proposed. What do they kind of think about those big spending bills as a whole?
Yeah, they're growing more concerned. I think, look, in the beginning, he had a little bit of political capital on handling the pandemic. Going back to last year when we did the discussions with suburban voters, the coronavirus pandemic was far and away the number one, concern, during that time. But now that we're getting past the stimulus checks, and now we're getting into other things like a tax increase, like infrastructure, whatever else they're going to throw out there, right? There's a very big concern about what's going to happen when the bill comes due. Are they getting what they're paying for? They're paying, I just did actually focus groups a couple weeks ago in a state that had flipped from Trump to Biden among voters there. And they were talking about, they're paying school taxes, property taxes, income taxes, gas tax. They're paying for all this stuff, and they've been paying for it during the pandemic. For what we're paying in, are we getting the right services? And right now there's some concern about that. And again, with schools, a lot of people with the school issue in a lot of suburban communities across the country and reopenings, there was a lot of frustration about, hey, we're still paying for taxes. We're still paying for this education for our kids, through our taxes, and we're not getting it. And I think it also goes to looking at maybe at a larger scale, is suburban voters are very concerned about Democrats being in control or complete control of DC right now. They want checks and balances. They worry about overreach. And I think it's a good opportunity for Republicans. I think it's a good opportunity for Republicans nationally to push back on that. And then also, depending on what state you live in and what your governor or state legislative, makeups look like, I think it's also probably a good way to push back, at the state level as well.
Yeah. So kind of on that same thread, do you think it's a good opportunity for state Republicans to kind of draw a contrast when they're from these conservative states that have had strong balanced budgets? Because we saw the blue state bailout in one of the COVID packages before. And so do you think that that's a good contrast that they should be making in, states like Iowa and Florida? And
yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity. I think it's more so of an opportunity, especially in states where you have a blue governor and a red legislature. I think of a state like Michigan, for example, or Pennsylvania. And I'd also think about just broadening that argument a little bit too, to make it, also looking at the reopenings, during COVID of red states versus blue states, and look at the states that have been, kind of red controlled, like a Florida and Texas, and compare that to what's going on in states like New York and California. I think broadening that makes a lot of sense in terms of an argument and a message for 21 and 22, because the other thing is that we've learned in this research is politics is no longer local. I mean, politics is national. I mean, we're looking at suburban voters across the country that all have shared experiences, similar issue concerns, similar policy positions. And there's really, with social media, with the preponderance of cable news and how people are consuming information, we are in national elections year in and year out. And so I think broadening that argument, not just on spending and balanced budgets, to just kind of which direction are red states going in, or states where you can have Republican control versus blue states, I think is a good approach.
Reopenings, economic recovery, COVID, all of it. It all kind of fits together to create its own narrative. We were talking a little bit about spending earlier. Do you think that suburban voters have a grasp on how Biden's $3 trillion infrastructure proposal is actually going to impact them?
Most suburban voters do want traditional infrastructure improvements. They do think that roads and bridges are not doing, are not in good shape. But when we pushed in on the social welfare components, that was a big red flag to a lot of voters. A laundry list of social welfare components is how they described it. Quite a few were against the free community college and government paying for childcare and kind of all these like sweeteners in these bills that the Democrats are passing. And along those lines, they worry about, I think, the cost of possible tax hikes that are coming with this. It's not just, I think, the worry that what are we getting our money, or what are we getting for what we're paying for here? But I also think there's also a big concern about we're going to keep throwing money at things. And there's a big concern, especially with Republicans and especially with these conservative independents and more fiscally conservative voters in a lot of suburban areas across the country. There's a worry that the federal government's going to mismanage this. They're not going to be able to get out of their own way. And then guess what's going to happen? The costs and it's going to spill over to the average American. It's just, there's a lot of disillusionment, I think, right now with government in general. And they're not trusted to do the right things right now.
What do they think about the government's handling of what's going on at the border?
At the border, not well. What was really interesting here is we asked, top issues, top concerns. The issue at the border came up organically. as a big concern. Almost all suburban voters that we spoke with said that there's a crisis, right now at the border. What's interesting is they blame Biden. They say he's rolling back Trump policies. And again, suburban voters, they narrowly went for Biden. So, I mean, these aren't necessarily like, MAGA Trump people, that are saying this. And I think this is an issue that Republicans can do well on and win in the suburbs. They're also concerned about, Biden's encouraging rhetoric for the massive increase in migrants. And what's interesting is I think some voters in the suburbs recognize that Trump's policies were stronger, but they didn't necessarily approve of them because of his rhetoric about immigration or because they just didn't personally like him. But when they're seeing the opposite of this, holy smokes, they're not happy. And we tested last week Biden's handling on 8 different issues, as president, from crime and taxes and coronavirus. The lowest approval rating he had on any of the 8 issues was his handling of border security and immigration. Just 33% of Americans approved of it, 59% disapproved. So again, this is a guy that won, a slim majority nationally, who's now underwater by 26 points on border security and immigration. And they see his policies nationally and again in the suburbs as more likely to encourage people to make the dangerous journey to the United States.
Do they still view Joe Biden as a moderate even after all of these pretty far left policies that he's been pushing?
Yeah, Biden is interesting. He's a little Teflon in that regard, because he's personally viewed pretty favorably amongst suburban voters, even though there's a lot of concerns about his coronavirus agenda. Republicans are already there. Republicans are already, he's going to be a socialist. He's, enabling the far left. But suburban voters, especially those more, center right, they're still not sure. I think there's more work to be done there in terms of defining the president by those policies. I think Republicans, look, I look at suburban voters as kind of free agents, and urban voters are going to go 2-to-1 Democrat, rural voters 2-to-1 Republican. Suburban voters are always right down the middle, and there's a significant chunk of that cohort that are up for grabs and free agents. And I think we got to make the sale to those folks over the next year and a half, going into the midterms, that Biden is a liberal, but also he's a tool of the radical left. He is helping push their agenda. He's helping Kamala Harris. He's helping Nancy Pelosi, AOC. And I think that the recent policy and spending proposals, again, once we move past the pandemic from a legislative standpoint, I think they only add more credit to that. It's going to make it an easier lift for us in a messaging campaign.
What do you think Republicans should be focusing their messaging on then to these types of voters?
Suburban voters are very concerned about what Democrats are doing in complete control in DC right now. They want check and balances. They worry about overreach. They worry about value when it comes to taxes and spending. They worry about the crisis of the border. So I think the overarching argument is pretty simple. I think we need to, going into 22 especially, we need to create a referendum on Democratic rule in DC. And as that filters down to certain states, I think, since we are in a national political environment, the governor's races and state legislative races in Michigan and Florida and Pennsylvania and Arizona and all these places, Georgia, these key swing areas, they are going to be influenced by the national policy debate and what's going on in terms of the national political environment. They always are. And so I think just as the Democrats did successfully in 2018 against us, just as we did successfully in 2010 and in 94 against, Obama and Clinton, I think we have to create a referendum on what's going on in Washington and push back on it. I think that right now it looks like that's what this is developing into, which is, I would say, pretty typical for a midterm year. But I think that we got to take a bigger look at kind of where's this country going, and we need somebody in Washington to have a check and balance on what Biden and the Biden administration are trying to do.
With the 24/7 news cycle and everything kind of changing so much, do you think people are going to forget about all of these things by the time that the 2022 elections come around?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's very difficult to predict, next month what's going to happen, or even next week, as opposed to a year and a half from now. I think that's where, advertising comes in. I think that's where having message discipline on the right is really important, and being strategic about what we talk about. And I think it's also, we have to remind people. I mean, I think, again, we have to go back and remind people of like, hey, when in February of 2020, here's where the economy was. Here's what taxes look like. Things were pretty darn good. And then boom, the pandemic hit, and it was terrible for everybody, and small businesses and low income earners and just everybody across and parents and just everybody across the country. But now we're getting back to it. Why wouldn't we go back to what was working well for us as a nation? And I think we have to remind people of that. And I think that's the thing too. All the stuff that's happening now and into the next year, because who knows what could happen. We have to be continually repetitive and reminding voters of what the Democrats are doing, an unchecked Washington, if you will, and continue to push back on that.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have any final thoughts today that you'd like to share with our audience?
No, I would just say I think 2022 I think it will be a good year for Republicans. I really do. I think if you look at what happened in last week's special election in Texas, the congressional Democrats who always have had little enthusiasm for Biden to begin with, because the 2020 race was really just a referendum on Trump. They didn't even bother to show up. Republican had a clean sweep of the top two spots. I think that's a little bit of an understory in DC because the press just hasn't been writing about it as much. I think that's a big tell of where things are directionally going. Think about 22, I'd bet on change. There have been 11 national elections since 2000, including midterm years. In only 2 of those years did the White House, Senate, or House not change. I mean, there's going to be a shift or change. And for the first time in history, 4 successive presidents now have lost control of Congress during their term. So, I mean, there's definitely historical precedent for a good year for Republicans. And then more specifically, Biden's approval rating, I think, is really important to watch. For folks watching this or listening to this, that's something I would keep a very close eye on. It's usually the best predictor of whether the incumbent party gains or loses seats in the House, which is always a foreshadow for what happens in state houses, in governor's races, local races. Since the 1960s, presidents with an approval rating between 49 and 59, so a positive approval rating, their party loses on average 21 seats in the House. So, I mean, there's always that little itch to kind of revert back a little bit. If the president's job approval falls below 49%, which it was for Trump, which it was for Obama, which it was for Bush in 06 and Clinton in 94, the party loses, about 40 seats in the House. So, I mean, you could see a big shift, and that's not even taking into effect reapportionment and redistricting that's going to happen in a lot of state houses. So right now, look, Biden's hovering around 50% in terms of job approval. Given the extreme partisanship that's going on right now, his approval's probably at a pretty high, almost to a ceiling at this point, given where he is with Democrats. And so it's probably more likely his approval dips down in the 40s as opposed to rises up higher in the 50s. So I'm pretty optimistic about our chances in 22, but we got to go out and, make the sale and convert those free agents in the suburbs to, Republican voters.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that our conversation today is pretty helpful for people that are listening and ready to gear up for all of that. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great to hear your insight on all of this. And thank you everybody for listening, for watching. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to the pod on. And always remember, state politics have implications that are bigger than you think.